Hey guys, tonight, we drift back through the misty folds of time into a world of flickering candlelight, creaking wooden floors, and soft whispers echoing from cold stone walls. You're standing on a dirt road, in the heart of a medieval village, the evening fog curling around your ankles like curious cats. A blacksmith's hammer rings in the distance, and somewhere behind a crooked wooden fence, children chase a dog too small for the chase. But you're about to walk straight into the uncomfortable reality of marriage during the Middle Ages. And let's just say, you probably wouldn't survive this one with your modern sensibilities intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is, because I love seeing who's drifting off with me around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is how small everything is. The cottages, the fields, even the people, leaner, sun-worn, and always in motion. This is a world without weekends or retirement, where childhood flickers by in a flash, and adulthood arrives early sometimes before you've even lost your last baby tooth. You wander past a weaving woman with a babe strapped to her back, and you realize she can't be more than 13. In this medieval village, the concept of childhood as you know it doesn't exist. You're either a child or you're not, and that boundary is razor thin. The age of marriage wasn't some fixed number scrawled on parchment and enforced by rule of law. It was elastic shifting with religion, class, geography, and desperation. For peasant girls, the age could be startlingly young. As early as 12 girls might be married off, especially if the family had one too many mouths to feed or a political alliance, even a small village one to seal. A priest would nod, the couple would say vows, and a life together, often hard and brief, would begin. For boys, it was usually a bit later. 14 or 15 was common, but many waited until their 20s if they needed to inherit land or establish a trade first. But marriage at these ages didn't always mean immediate cohabitation or consummation. Canon law, the church's law, technically allowed girls to marry at 12 and boys at 14. Yet even the church suggested waiting until the age of reason, often interpreted as a few years older before the physical side of marriage began. Still, local practice didn't always follow official doctrine. You walk past a tiny stone church with a thatched roof and a rusted iron bell hanging overhead. A marriage is being celebrated not with music and champagne, but with stale bread, dried apples, and the awkward clapping of muddy hands. The bride is about 13. The groom is 17 and already has the permanent squint of someone who's worked under the sun too long. They're not in love. They're participants in a survival pact. You sit on a stump as a neighbor explains that for peasants, love was a luxury. Marriage was about merging fields, ensuring inheritance, securing labor. A daughter could be given away in exchange for livestock tools or a promised future alliance. And as grim as it sounds, it was often viewed as protection. Better a husband than the dangers of a single girl alone, vulnerable to assault, starvation, or suspicion. But things looked different for the noble classes. If you tiptoe past the village edge where the mud gives way to gravel roads and the smell of dung is replaced by the distant perfume of rose water, you find yourself facing a tall stone manor. A tapestry sways in the open window. Inside, a girl no older than 10 is being betrothed to a boy she's never met, an heir in a distant region. These marriages were often arranged when the children were infants. A noble family might secure a contract promising their daughter to the son of a baron or duke the moment she was born. Love had no place here either, just dynastic ambition. These children were pawns in political chess games, moved before they understood the rules. A girl might be sent to live with her future in-laws as a sort of early investment. By the time the marriage was formalized, she might feel more like a servant than a bride. Still, not all was cruelty. Some noble unions once forced into existence bloomed into partnerships. Letters between certain couples hint at affection, trust, and even humor. You catch a glimpse of a parchment on a desk where a young wife writes to her husband, "Your absence weighs heavier than the winter frost upon my window." In a world where choices were rare, some found ways to turn constraint into comfort. But for every affectionate, noble union, there were 10 that were cold and formal, especially among royalty. Kings and queens married for treaties and territories, not tenderness. Eleanor of Aquitaine married Louis VII of France when she was around 15. Anne of Bohemia married Richard II of England at 16. Sometimes the queen was the elder. Margaret of Anjou was married at 15 to a mentally unstable Henry VI. These were not love stories. They were negotiations sealed with veils, rings, and unbearable pressure. And yet age didn't always equal power. You pause outside a hut where an old woman tells stories by firelight. She was married at 12, bore 7 children, and now lives with a widowed daughter-in-law who was married at 15. There's a grim pride in her voice, like surviving a storm that others didn't. She remembers her wedding like it was yesterday, the ache in her feet from new shoes, the clumsy kiss, the way her mother cried without smiling. She says the hardest part wasn't being young, it was having no say. Her husband was twice her age. He didn't beat her, but he treated her like a tool. Only when he died when she was 30 and considered an old woman did she feel something like freedom. You lie back in the grass under a darkening sky. The stars above are the same ones those brides and grooms looked at centuries ago. Some of them might have felt wonder, others nothing at all. But all of them, rich or poor, noble or peasant, shared one thing: they married, because that's what the world demanded of them. Choice was rare. Timing was dictated by hunger, ambition, and the whispers of elders. And love. Well, if it came at all, it came later. The wind picks up and carries the smell of smoke and old bread through the air. You close your eyes, listening to the hum of crickets and distant bells. And just like that, the village around you begins to fade, slipping gently into memory as we move forward in time, where marriage would evolve but never quite escape the shadows of its medieval roots. You're still lying in the grass when the sounds around you begin to change. The crickets fade into birdsong. The muddy footsteps of villagers melt into the soft clip-clop of hooves, and when you open your eyes again, you're somewhere new. The same medieval world, yes, but a little farther inland, a little deeper into the forests and customs that shaped the fabric of everyday life. A place where marriage is not just a personal union, it's a public institution. And the age at which people entered it could mean the difference between survival and scandal. You follow a winding dirt path into a small hamlet where the wooden houses huddle together for warmth. Every building here seems to lean in slightly, like they're whispering secrets. The people are suspicious of strangers, but a friendly baker, flour coating his knuckles, welcomes you with a nod. His daughter was just married last spring at the age of 14. She's already expecting her first child. But don't assume this was an anomaly. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in rural areas, girls marrying in their early teens was considered entirely appropriate, sometimes even necessary. There weren't schools or apprenticeships waiting for them. There were no long periods of youth spent exploring identities or hobbies. Life expectancy, hovered around 30 to 40 years for many. To delay marriage was in some eyes to waste precious time. Yet for men, the expectations often skewed older. Most young men didn't marry until they could support a household, which meant acquiring land tools, livestock, or a trade. A man of 24 was still seen as young and desirable husband material. A woman of 24, however, might already be viewed as less ideal, especially if she hadn't borne children yet. The pressure on women to marry young wasn't only social, it was practical, biological, and deeply baked into the very structure of the world they lived in. As you walk through the village square, you pass a gathering of elders under a great elm tree. One of them tells a story of a girl named Matilda who reached the scandalous age of 18 unmarried. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Was she cursed, rebellious, unfit? Her father finally arranged a hasty marriage with a widower nearly twice her age. The union wasn't happy, but it ended the gossip. That's the thing about marriage in this time, it wasn't about personal fulfillment. It was about status, reputation, and lineage. Especially for women, an unmarried status past puberty marked you as odd, unlucky, or defiant. Your value was tied not just to your dowry or your domestic skills, but to your perceived fertility and timing. And yet across Europe, patterns diverged more than you might expect. In southern Europe, Italy, Spain, and parts of France, marriages tended to happen earlier. In these regions, a girl's transition to marriage around the ages of 12 to 14 was often part of a tightly controlled family strategy. The warmer climate also influenced cultural practices, including earlier puberty and different expectations for household structures. Families stayed tightly knit. Multi-generational homes were common. A young bride would often continue to live under her parents' or in-laws' supervision long after the wedding. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, particularly in England and the Low Countries, people tended to marry later. Girls often wed in their late teens or even early 20s. Here, the nuclear family model started to emerge, newlyweds setting up their own households rather than folding into larger, extended ones. As a result, economic self-sufficiency became a prerequisite for marriage. You couldn't marry unless you could afford it, which often delayed the process for both men and women. Some historians call this the European marriage pattern, and it would end up influencing everything from population growth to labor dynamics for centuries to come. You turn a corner and enter a small chapel drawn in by the sound of humming. A wedding is underway, not lavish or loud, but solemn and steeped in ritual. The bride is 16, the groom perhaps 20. They kneel before the altar, and a priest with a heavy accent begins the Latin rites. The ceremony is more than religious, it's legal, spiritual, and social all at once. By the time they rise, they're not just married. They are now participants in a cosmic structure designed to preserve order in an unpredictable world. And that structure depended on marriage happening at the right time. Too early, and the couple might struggle to survive. Too late, and the woman's prospects could diminish sharply. This delicate balance of readiness and respectability governed nearly every decision parents made. It also meant that marriage wasn't just between two individuals, it was between families, even communities. You exit the chapel and find yourself beside a winding river where two older women wash linens on smooth stones. Their chatter is low but animated, and you catch pieces of a familiar story. A girl in the next village ran away to avoid a forced marriage. She was only 13, and the man was old, cruel, and rich. She fled into the woods and hasn't been seen since. One woman mutters that she's likely dead. The other hopes she found a nunnery. And that's another piece of the puzzle. For girls with few options or those unwilling to marry, religious life sometimes offered a refuge. Convents welcomed girls as young as 7. Some were placed there by families too poor to arrange a marriage. Others entered by choice, preferring prayer and quiet over the risks of childbirth and housework. But life inside the walls was no picnic either. Convent life came with strict discipline, isolation, and rigid gender expectations cloaked in sanctity. Still, some women found real autonomy there. As a nun, you could read, you could write. You might even run the finances of your order. And while the world outside valued you for your womb inside the convent, you were valued for your soul. For some, that trade was worth it. As you follow the riverbank farther, the landscape begins to stretch out, more fields, more lives, more variations on the same basic theme. Marriage was inevitable. Its age, its form, its terms, all fluid but rarely up to the people in it. A girl might beg for more time. A boy might long for love. But more often than not, the clock ran faster than their hearts could keep up. And as the sun dips lower, casting golden light across the rippling water, you think about the weight of time. Not just the passage of years, but the expectation of what each year should bring. By 12, useful. By 13, prepared. By 14, married. And all the while childhood slipped away unnoticed, like water between your fingers. But don't worry, we're just getting started. The story of medieval marriage is far from over. There are still forests to wander, castles to explore, and truths to uncover. So stay close and let the hush of history carry you forward. You wake up not fully aware you'd even drifted off and find yourself walking through the outer walls of a bustling medieval town. This isn't the sleepy hamlet of before this place pulses with life. Market stalls overflow with salted fish, apples, and scratchy wool tunics. The clang of blacksmiths, the clamor of hawkers, the bray of donkeys. It's a chorus of commerce and survival. Here, marriage isn't just a family affair. It's a civic matter entangled in guild laws, local customs, and economic strategies. And once again, the age at which people marry is never quite simple. You slip through the crowd toward a guild hall where a wedding is being registered, not celebrated, but logged. In towns like these, especially in the later Middle Ages, marriages were increasingly documented by civic authorities. That's because in a growing urban economy, property inheritance and reputation had monetary weight. Who you married and when could affect your trade access, your apprenticeship rights, and your place in the local hierarchy. A 14-year-old girl named Lynn sits quietly beside her mother, while her new husband, a 19-year-old journeyman tailor, fills out a crude marriage record. It's their second time at the hall. The first time he didn't have enough coin to cover the licensing fee. This time he's brought a bundle of dyed cloth as a partial payment. The clerk shrugs and accepts it. Paperwork. Complete, the marriage is now both public and permanent. And Lane, still not used to her long veil or her stiff new shoes, will spend tonight in a house she's never slept in before, beside a boy she's barely spoken to. This isn't a storybook romance, but it is by the standards of the day a good match. He has skills. She has a small dowry. Both families gain status, and neither is too old or too young by local standards. She's considered ripe for household labor and future motherhood. He's strong enough to earn, but still young enough to start fresh. In towns like this, efficiency trumps sentiment. But as you explore the alleys and overhear scraps of conversation, you learn that not all marriages are so straightforward. In cities, the range of marital ages is wider. Some girls, especially orphans or daughters of widows, are married off at 12 or 13 with no one to protect their interests. Others, especially daughters of wealthier merchants, might remain single into their late teens or even early 20s, waiting for a match, that will protect their inheritance or business rights. You pass by one such woman, Marika, who is 20 and still unmarried. Her father owns a prosperous wine shop, and her dowry is rumored to be generous. She's educated, too able to read inventories and sign her name. Her parents are waiting for a suitor with political or trade connections that match their ambition. In her fine green dress and polished boots, she looks nothing like the child brides of the countryside. But behind her composed smile, you catch the flicker of exhaustion. Even freedom comes with a cost. You wander into a nearby church and see another marriage unfolding. This one is secret. The girl is clearly underage, the boy trembling as he speaks his vows. They're not from this town. They've fled from nearby villages, hoping that in the anonymity of the city, their love, or at least their desperation, can be turned into something permanent. The priest hesitates, but ultimately blesses them. Once a marriage is declared in front of witnesses and consummated, the church is reluctant to undo it. That's one reason why elopements, though risky, were sometimes the only way young people could rebel against arranged matches or forced unions. The church plays an enormous role in all of this. It holds authority over marriage, declaring it a sacrament, a holy bond that no man or woman should dissolve. By church law, the minimum age for marriage is 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But even within religious circles, there's debate about what's appropriate. Some clergymen preach that early marriage leads to vice and sin, while others argue that it protects against it. One particularly stern monk you overhear insists that marriage is the only barrier between youth and temptation. Better a child bride than a wandering eye, he says, not unkindly, but with a complete absence of irony. This duality between protection and oppression defines much of medieval marriage. What you might see as exploitation, they may have seen as salvation. A way to protect young women from dishonor, to guarantee their future, to lock in stability in a volatile world. And yet many still suffered. Age alone didn't shield anyone from loneliness, abuse, or indifference. Outside the convent walls, things were just as complicated. You pass an abbey school where girls in simple habits recite Latin prayers. One of them, barely 11, glances at you with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. She was promised to the church before she could walk. Her dowry wasn't money, but land, a generous donation to the abbey in exchange for taking her in. In a few years, she'll take her vows. She'll never marry. But in the eyes of her family, she's fulfilling a different kind of destiny. Back in the streets, a bell rings out, the curfew bell. You find yourself standing near a row of shuttered houses, smoke curling gently from chimney stacks. Behind those wooden doors, couples, some young, some older, settle into their routines. Marriage for them is not an event. It's a structure, a role, a constant. Whether entered at 12, 16, or 22, the outcome is rarely passion. It's partnership, labor, survival. And if you had asked them whether they thought they were too young, they might have tilted their heads in confusion. Too young for what? For responsibility, for motherhood, for housework. Their world didn't accommodate that question. Life came fast, hard, and early. Childhood was brief. Marriage was the gateway to adulthood. And that gateway came sooner than most of us could ever imagine. As the sky darkens into ink and the stars start their quiet watch, you find yourself stepping away from the stone streets and into the forested path beyond the town. There are more stories ahead, more corners of medieval life to uncover. Because while the church may have defined marriage's borders and the economy may have shaped its timing, the people, their hopes, fears, and quiet rebellions are what give it its human shape. So keep walking deeper into the trees, where the glow of hearth fires fades and the truth of time stretches out before you. The forest path narrows as you press onward, the moon casting silver patterns on the mossy earth. You pass beneath branches that creak softly overhead, their leaves whispering the secrets of those long since wed betrothed or forgotten. The deeper you go, the quieter the world becomes, until the stillness is broken by the distant cry of a newborn. You follow the sound, and soon you stumble upon a cottage, warm light spilling from its crooked shutters. Inside, a young girl clutches a swaddled infant to her chest. She can't be older than 15. Her husband is not in sight. He's likely in the fields or perhaps at the village alehouse, but the signs of her new life are everywhere. A cradle by the fire, herbs drying over the door, half-mended linens in a basket. You're witnessing what marriage meant for so many medieval girls, not just a vow, not just a title, but a transformation. Overnight, they went from daughters to wives, then mothers. And all of it happened so fast, they barely had time to catch their breath. You sit quietly on a log outside the house as her mother-in-law, a stout woman with work-worn hands, joins you. She tells you that she was married at 13, gave birth at 14, and buried her first child by 15. Her tone is matter-of-fact, not bitter. That's just how it was, she says with a shrug, as if there was no other path to walk. And in truth, for most people in the Middle Ages, there wasn't. This is what you begin to understand, while church law and civic rules laid out the technical minimum ages for marriage. The lived reality of when people married was dictated by something more primal necessity. Life was fragile. A poor harvest, a bad illness, or a feuding neighbor could unravel everything. And marriage, even at an age that today would feel shockingly young, was often seen as a way to weave things back together. Families needed alliances. Communities needed stability. And individuals, especially women, needed protection. But the consequences were enormous. Early marriage often meant early childbirth. And childbirth in the medieval world was not a gentle thing. Without modern medicine, even the most routine birth carried the risk of death. For young girls whose bodies were not fully developed, the danger multiplied. Pelvic bones too narrow, malnourishment, infections. You hear stories whispered through the village of girls who never recovered, who died in labor before their 16th birthday. Their graves, if they were lucky enough to have one, are marked not with names, but with the faint outline of a cross. And yet, as you move from one hamlet to the next, you begin to see the diversity of experience. In some places, marriages are formal and meticulously arranged. In others, they're sudden, sparked by pregnancy or scandal. One innkeeper tells you of a couple who wed at 15 and 17, but only after being caught too close by the river one summer evening. To avoid public shame, the village priest married them before the next Sabbath. Their union, he claims, turned out to be one of the happiest he'd seen. There's a strange duality here. On one hand, society pushes people, especially girls, into marriage early. On the other hand, it punishes those who appear too eager or act outside the bounds of formal process. A girl who marries at 12 under the right conditions is respectable. A girl who shows affection at 13 without permission is dishonored. The rules aren't just strict, they're contradictory. You step into a field where workers are harvesting rye. One of them, a gangly boy of 16, tells you his marriage was delayed because of a failed crop. Without a secure food store, his bride's father refused to finalize the match. A man can't feed a wife on promises, he says with a grin, wiping sweat from his brow. He finally wed at 19, later than most of his friends, but says it was worth the wait. His wife, he boasts, is kind and good with the goats. And that's love in its own rustic way. You walk farther, passing travelers on the road, pilgrims, merchants, wandering minstrels. Each carries tales from different lands. and you gather bits of marriage lore from every region. In the Alps, some girls are wed young to secure property on steep, hard-to-reach farms. In the lowlands, wealthier families might keep daughters unmarried longer to negotiate better dowries. In the colder north, seasonal marriages planned around harvests and winters are common. Everywhere, the definition of the right age shifts just slightly, like the border of a map drawn by a trembling hand. Eventually, you arrive at a fair on the edge of a town. The music is lively, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat and hay. Here you see another aspect of medieval marriage, the festival betrothal. In more rural or independent communities, matches are made during fairs or saints' days, often sparked by mutual interest, rather than family arrangement. It's not quite courtship, as you'd imagine it today, but there's a spark of spontaneity here, of youth trying to carve space for itself in a world that rarely allows such freedom. You watch as a girl of perhaps 16 dances near a bonfire. A boy barely older throws her a garland of flowers. Their parents are nearby watching, but not interfering. A few words are exchanged. A plan is made. If all goes well, the two will be married before the next moon. It's not rebellion. It's simply life. The fair fades into the dark as the fires burn low. You walk back along the moonlit path, now lined with distant cottages and low stone fences. Everywhere you go, you carry pieces of these stories. Young brides, tired mothers, arranged matches. Elopements, tragedies, and small, quiet joys. Each one different. Each one shaped by the time, the place, the family. But the thread tying them all together is this: people didn't marry because they were ready. They married because the world expected them to. And when your entire life is structured around obedience, whether to your father, your priest, or the turning of the seasons, you don't ask if you're old enough. You ask if it's time. And for most, time came far too early. Still, the path ahead stretches on. There are more tales to uncover, more voices to hear. So take a breath. Feel the cool night air in your lungs, and follow me deeper into the heart of this forgotten world. You wake to the gentle swaying of a cart straw rustling beneath you, wheels bumping over uneven ground. A soft morning mist clings to the fields on either side of the road. You're not sure how you got here, but no one seems to notice your presence, not the driver humming a quiet hymn, nor the pigs squealing faintly from the back. You're passing through the countryside once again, where the rhythms of life are slower, steadier, but no less defined by the age-old traditions of marriage. The driver is an older man named Henrik, wiry and sun-browned. As he talks, he tells you he was wed at 21, an old man by local standards. He chuckles. His wife was just 14. He says it with no shame or discomfort, simply as a matter of fact. He explains that her family was eager to secure her future after a bad winter nearly wiped out their grain stores. She came with a goat, 2 clay jars, and a small linen chest. That was the marriage price, simple, practical, just enough to show good faith. And yet when he talks about her, there's tenderness in his voice. She laughed like a stream over pebbles, he says, eyes distant. She died in childbirth at 17. Their second child survived. He never remarried. This kind of quiet heartbreak saturates the medieval world. Early marriage isn't just a matter of youth, it's a gamble. Girls were often married not because they were ready, but because their families feared what might happen if they waited. A girl without a husband could become a burden, a temptation, or a target. A married girl, even a child, was seen as protected. As you journey farther with Henrik's cart, you pass a small village where a wedding is about to take place. Everyone is gathering in the churchyard dressed in their rough-spun best. The bride, no older than 13, wears a crown of dried flowers and a nervous smile. The groom is 18, sturdy from farm work, and clearly unsure of how to hold himself. The priest blesses them quickly. It's a weekday, and there are other ceremonies to tend to. Afterward, the village celebrates in a way that feels both joyful and mechanical. Bread is passed, ale is poured, feet stamp the ground to the rhythm of a fiddle. But behind it all is the unspoken truth. This is not just a celebration. It's a checkpoint, a transition. Childhood, such as it was, is now officially over. You walk with the newlyweds as they're escorted to their new home. The walls are bare. The roof leaks slightly. But it's theirs, or at least their family's. The bride's mother lingers at the doorway, giving last-minute advice about boiling water and keeping the fire lit. The young husband stands awkwardly near the doorframe, unsure whether to speak or wait. You can almost hear the weight of expectation pressing down on both of them. And then, in a softer moment, the girl picks up a small cat from the floor and giggles as it climbs up her arm. Just like that, she's a child again, for a breath, for a blink. And then it passes. As you step back out into the dirt road, you begin to piece together just how complex the age of marriage truly was. It wasn't the same for everyone, not even close. Among the lower classes, peasants, craftsmen, laborers, marriage was often delayed until there were means to support a household. But if a girl's family could secure a dowry, or if survival depended on merging households quickly, age became secondary. In bad years, girls married younger. In good years, families could afford to wait. The age of marriage flexed with the weather, the harvest, and the whims of fate. Among the middle classes, particularly in towns and trading communities, the marriage market became more strategic. Daughters were bargaining chips in the games of guild alliances and merchant networks. You hear of one girl in a bustling market town who was betrothed at 10, married at 14, and managing her husband's accounts by 15. She couldn't read, but she could tally, and that was enough. Among the nobility, things grew even more intricate. You find yourself wandering through the outer gardens of a manor estate, watching a noble family arrange a betrothal. The girl is 9. The groom is 15, heir to a neighboring barony. The wedding won't happen for a few years, but the contract is already signed. Gold changes hands. Land rights are discussed. A small ring is placed on the child's finger. She barely understands the moment, but her governess gently tells her, "You'll grow into it." In these circles, marriage is politics. The couple may never fall in love. They may barely live together. The husband might be called to war or assigned to another estate. But the match is sealed, the alliance made. For the girl, life will now revolve around court appearances, fertility expectations, and obedience. You stop beneath a canopy of old yew trees, the air heavy with the scent of earth and pine. A woman in her 60s walks slowly along the edge of the path, collecting herbs. She tells you that she was married at 15 to a man she barely knew. "I didn't love him," she says plainly, "but I came to respect him." She raises her hand to show you the faded scar on her palm, where she once cut herself gathering kindling. He nursed her wound for weeks. That, she says, was the first time she saw him as human, not just a husband, but a person. This quiet revelation stays with you as the afternoon fades into dusk. You realize that many of these early marriages weren't shaped by cruelty, but by a deep indifference to the concept of childhood. There was simply no space in medieval life for prolonged innocence. You worked, you wed, you bore children, and if you were lucky, you survived long enough to tell the tale. Still, survival didn't always mean contentment. Some young brides ran away. Some chose convents. Some simply faded into the background, bearing child after child, until their names were forgotten. and some remarkably found joy. Because even in a world so tightly controlled by rules and roles, people are still people. Some couples learned to laugh. Some discovered companionship. Some, even in marriages forged too early, found a kind of peace. And so, as the moon rises once more and casts pale light across the road, you keep walking through fields and memories, through stories buried in time, knowing there's still more to uncover in the strange, sobering world of medieval marriage. You follow the sound of bells, soft, deliberate tolls echoing over a mist-covered valley, and find yourself approaching a monastery perched on the hillside. The air is cooler here, touched with the scent of wet stone and wild thyme. As you near the carved wooden gates, a monk greets you without surprise, as though he's been expecting you for centuries. He motions for you to follow, and soon you're wandering quiet cloisters where footsteps are muffled by worn flagstones and lives unfold at a gentler rhythm. This place is not untouched by marriage, though its residents wear no rings. Quite the opposite. For centuries, monasteries and nunneries served as both sanctuary and escape from the rigid expectations of marriage. And many of those who ended up here, especially women, did so precisely because they never reached the right age to marry, or perhaps reached it too soon. You sit beneath an arched window with an elderly nun named Sister Elsbeth. Her face is weathered like old leather, and her hands shake slightly as she braids a length of rush. She was placed here at the age of 8, promised to God, as the tithe of a wealthy merchant. Her 2 older sisters were married off by 14, but Elsbeth was destined for the veil. She tells you with no bitterness that it was a safer fate. Her sisters bore too many children, buried too many infants, and died too soon. Elsbeth never married in the worldly sense, but she's lived long enough to watch generations pass through the gates, girls of all ages, some pious, some angry, some simply forgotten. Many were the leftovers, too old, too plain, too poor for a desirable match. Others were the rebellious ones sent away for resisting the marriages arranged for them. Here in these stone halls, they found a second kind of life. Not easy, not luxurious, but stable, predictable, free from the dread of dying in childbirth before 16. You begin to understand how medieval marriage wasn't only shaped by age, it was shaped by the narrow corridors people were forced to walk, and the occasional side door they stumbled through to avoid them. Leaving the monastery, you descend into a nearby town, smaller than the last, but louder. The market is in full swing, and there's a commotion outside a butcher's stall. A young girl, perhaps 11 or 12, stands between 2 arguing men, her father and her betrothed. The father is furious, accusing the man of trying to delay the marriage. The would-be husband, barely more than a teenager himself, insists he cannot afford a household just yet. A crowd gathers, murmuring. You can see the girl's face, she's trying hard not to cry. This isn't unusual. Disputes over timing were common. Once betrothed, a girl was considered partially claimed even if the wedding hadn't taken place. A lengthy delay could be interpreted as shameful a sign that the groom had second thoughts or that the girl wasn't desirable. Pressure mounted quickly. A father's pride, a family's honor, a girl's future, all tied to a timeline that rarely took feelings into account. And feelings in all this talk of age and duty seem almost alien. You pass a small chapel and hear a whispered confession between 2 lovers, unmarried, fearful, and desperately in love. The girl is 15, the boy 17. Their families disapprove. Their match would be considered impractical, wrong trades, wrong neighborhoods, not enough dowry. They plan to flee in the night, to start a life together elsewhere. Maybe they'll succeed. Maybe they'll be caught and forced apart. Or maybe, just maybe, their story will be quietly absorbed into the village's tapestry, accepted after the scandal fades. This is how many marriages happened, especially in smaller towns, less through ceremony, more through circumstance. A girl might become pregnant. A couple might be found together. A quiet agreement might be made over a loaf of bread and a jug of wine. In these cases, the marriage might follow quickly sanctified after the fact to keep the peace. Not all marriages started at the altar. Some started in a hayloft, a corner of the woods, or over stolen glances in a market square. And once they began, the age didn't matter as much as the outcome. Could she bear children? Could he bring in food? Could the two of them avoid scandal long enough to build something that looked like a life? You find yourself invited to dinner by a family of millers. The parents were married at 15 and 18. Their eldest daughter is now 12, and already suitors have come sniffing around, offering chickens and grain in exchange for early promises. The mother shakes her head. "Not yet," she says. She still laughs too much. It's the closest thing to sentiment you've heard all day. As the evening sun casts long shadows across the floor, you sit in the warmth of their cottage and listen to stories passed from generation to generation of child brides who became respected matriarchs of boys who ran away from arranged marriages to join monasteries, of young couples who married for love and lived in poverty, and of older women who quietly advised their daughters to wait just a little longer. In every corner of medieval life, marriage loomed. It was the skeleton key to adulthood, property, legacy, and safety. But beneath the rigid structure, there was movement, small rebellions, whispered refusals, tiny gestures of delay. And always the age of marriage stood at the center. Not just a number, but a mirror of the world's values. And so as the fire in the hearth begins to die down, and the stars rise over the village rooftops, you lie back and close your eyes. You can still hear the echo of wedding bells from somewhere far off, a sound that never truly leaves this world. Because in a time when choices were few and time was short, marriage came early, often too early, and it stayed like a shadow for the rest of a life. But don't drift off just yet. There are more roads to walk, more families to visit, and more secrets buried in the age-old question, when exactly was someone ready to marry? So take another breath, let your feet rest a moment, and when you're ready, we'll continue deeper into the past. The fire has burned low in the miller's cottage, and morning light pours softly through the cracks in the shutters. You rise, stretch, and find yourself walking once again, this time along a narrow cobbled road, winding through mist-draped hills. The air carries the scent of dew-soaked lavender and something heavier beneath damp wool, old earth, the quiet hum of responsibility pressing down on young shoulders. You're heading toward a manor estate where the rules of marriage take on new forms, more refined, more written down, but no less binding. Here, the age of marriage is etched in parchment and sealed with wax. Noble families do not rely on word-of-mouth agreements or community rituals. They deal in contracts, multi-page documents detailing dowries, land transfers, military alliances, and future heirs who haven't yet learned to walk. You enter the great hall of a stone manor and watch as a scribe reads aloud the terms of a union between a 12-year-old girl and a 14-year-old boy. Neither of them looks up. They stare at the floor, flanked by solemn-faced parents and servants too well trained to wince. This is not a wedding. It's a transaction, a chess move. The bride's dowry includes 2 chests of silver, a bolt of imported silk, and grazing rights in a neighboring valley. The groom brings a title, a name, and a claim to an aging fortress. The marriage won't be consummated for a few years, not until the girl is of age in body as well as law. But the deal is done. The pressure has already begun. Afterward, the children are led away separately, one to embroidery lessons, the other to swordplay. The adults linger, wine is poured, and the conversation shifts to taxes, rents, and court gossip. The young bride's voice, still light and reedy from girlhood, won't be heard again for hours. Outside the manor, a young chambermaid tells you the girl cried herself to sleep the first night after the contract was signed. She was still playing with a carved wooden horse when they pinned up her hair and changed her into formal gowns. But no one asked how she felt. Feelings don't factor into these arrangements. Age matters, but readiness, consent. Those are luxuries few can afford. And yet not all noble marriages are cold. You walk through the herb garden and listen to another story, this one whispered by a steward, about his late mistress, Lady Aveline. Married at 13 to a baron twice her age, she was terrified at first. But in time she found her voice. She managed his lands while he fought in France, read scripture in Latin, and raised their children with iron discipline. She ruled that house better than he ever did, the steward says. But it took 10 years before anyone dared say so out loud. So much of what determined a bride's experience wasn't just age, it was luck. The luck of having a kind husband. The luck of bearing children easily. The luck of surviving childbirth. And sometimes the luck of being clever enough to shape your world from within the narrow confines laid before you. You leave the estate and make your way to a nearby village where the local priest is tending his garden. He invites you in, eager to talk, and soon you're seated in his modest study, where rows of dog-eared texts line the shelves. He explains with a sigh that most people misunderstand church law about marriage. 12 for girls, 14 for boys, he recites. But that's only the technical minimum. In reality, he says he often discouraged such early unions unless there were exceptional circumstances, inheritance scandal, or parental death. God gave children years for growing, he adds. We shouldn't rush his plan. But his hands tremble slightly as he admits that few listened. Too often, hunger and fear outran his sermons. Parents pushed their daughters into early unions out of desperation. And while the church officially required mutual consent, how much consent can a child truly give? He shows you an old register, yellowed parchment, fragile at the edges. It lists marriages by name, date, and age. You scan the page. Girl 12, girl 13, boy 15, girl 11, betrothed only, he clarifies. Still, the names blur together in your mind. A quiet parade of childhoods folded neatly into adulthood, their pages turned before they were ready. As you leave the rectory, you find yourself standing by the village well where two older women wash laundry and share gossip. One mentions a local girl recently married at 14 who ran away with a traveling scribe. Another shakes her head. Foolish, she says, but brave. They laugh not unkindly. One of them admits she was 15 when she married a boy who smelled of turnips and fear. He grew on me, she shrugs, like mold on cheese. You realize then that even within these tight social molds, people found ways to live, sometimes even to love. Not everyone was crushed under the weight of early marriage. But many were bent, reshaped, forced to adapt far too soon. As the day wanes, you follow a dusty road to a riverside inn, where travelers share stories over mugs of warm ale. One man recounts a tale of a noblewoman who delayed her daughter's marriage until she turned 17. Nearly scandalous, he says, but it paid off. The girl learned to read, learned to manage the estate's ledgers, and when she finally married, she did so with a sharp mind and a steady hand. The innkeeper grins. Now she's running 3 manors and a vineyard. The room cheers, but you know such stories were the exception, not the rule. Most girls never had that grace period. Most never had a choice at all. As the stars emerge above the treetops and the inn falls quiet, you lie beneath an open window and listen to the river's gentle chatter. In the darkness, it's easy to imagine a different world, one where age wasn't just a number dictated by doctrine or desperation. A world where children were allowed to be children. But that wasn't the medieval world. In their world, marriage came early, often too early. And from the moment vows were spoken, the course of a life was set in motion, no matter how young the voice that said, "I do." Let the water lull you now, the hush of the inn, the slow turning of history just beneath your feet. There are still more stories to uncover, more hidden corners where the question of marriage age flickers in the candlelight, waiting to be remembered. So stay close. We're only halfway there. You wake to the sound of hooves splashing through shallow mud and the low chatter of merchants breaking camp. Morning light glints off copper pots and dented helmets as a trade caravan passes through a crossroads. You're back on the move again, drifting alongside wagons filled with wool wine and whispers from distant towns. And everywhere the conversation always circles back sooner or later to marriage, to age, to obligation. You walk beside a young merchant's apprentice, maybe 16. His hands are rough, his eyes alert. He tells you he's saving to marry the daughter of a spice seller in the next town over. She's 15. They've exchanged letters, awkward, ink-blotted things full of hopeful promises. But her father wants more than feelings. He wants coin, a dowry, proof. And so the boy walks, trades, waits, and dreams. In this world, love may light the spark, but money seals the match. You pause for lunch beneath a willow tree by the river, where two older women are resting their feet and comparing family stories. One of them sighs as she remembers her own marriage aged 14 to a man twice her age. He smelled like onions, and regret, she chuckles, but then her voice softens. He wasn't cruel, just tired. She says they learned to live together in silence. It wasn't love, but it was survival. And that in her eyes was enough. As the caravan moves on, you notice a subtle pattern emerging. Across regions, ages shift like the wind, but the reasoning stays the same. It's always about the future, securing it, managing it, bracing for it. Marriage is the medieval insurance policy against everything uncertain. Famine, war, orphanhood, dishonor. And in a world where the unexpected waits behind every season, no one wants to leave their daughters unwed for too long. You stop in a bustling riverside city where banners flap above stone walls and the market buzzes with voices in half a dozen dialects. Here, marriage becomes more complex, more performative. Rich merchants negotiate with legal scribes. Apprentices offer their services for months, just to earn the right to ask for a girl's hand. In one square, you see a teenage girl sitting still as a statue while a painter sketches her face. The portrait is to be sent to a suitor 3 cities away, along with a bolt of linen and a list of her father's holdings. She's 13. The suitor is 20. If he approves, the wedding will take place within the year. In this setting, age is treated like a ledger entry, just another line in the negotiation. The girl's voice, her desires, her readiness, they're whispers behind the ink. And yet you see her fingers trembling as she holds the pose, her knuckles white around a posy of dried herbs. It's clear that while the process may be routine, its cost is anything but. You duck into a quieter quarter of the city, where a small chapel houses a shrine to Saint Agnes, the patron saint of young girls, and fittingly of child brides. A nun tending the candles offers you a curious look, and then begins telling the story of the saint's martyrdom. 12 years old, she says, and refused to marry, kept her faith, died for it. There's reverence in her tone, but also something sharper, an undercurrent of grief. You get the feeling she's seen many girls who weren't granted even the choice to say no. That's one of the quiet tragedies you keep stumbling over. For all the ceremonies and contracts, the real missing piece in so many of these marriages was agency. A child's consent, after all, was a vague thing in practice. Technically, yes, church law insisted both parties agree freely. But who defines freedom when your entire life is shaped by what your parents need, what your village expects, and what God or those who speak for him commands? You visit a nearby school run by monks, where boys learn to read Latin and girls learn to stitch samplers. One of the girls, small and sharp-eyed, confides that she hopes to stay here until 16. "That's when my cousin married," she whispers. "And she lived." The others nod solemnly, as if she's cracked some secret code. There's no giggling, no daydreaming, just quiet calculations of how to stay alive inside the rules. As dusk approaches, you walk through a city garden filled with stone benches and tangled roses. An elderly man feeds sparrows from a pouch of crumbs and invites you to sit. He was a scribe for 30 years, wrote hundreds of marriage contracts. He tells you the youngest bride he ever documented was 11. The oldest groom, 56. It was all legal, he says, but not all right. Then he looks out over the pond and mutters almost to himself, "We were better at binding paper than protecting children." That's when it hits you. The machinery of marriage in the Middle Ages was vast, complex, and often blind to the human heart. It worked to serve inherent social order and economic need. But the people within it, especially the young, were often swept along without a voice. And yet, not everything was bleak. In one quiet square, you see an older couple dancing slowly to the music of a street fiddler. They were wed as teenagers long before they understood what marriage truly meant. And yet somehow, they made it work. Their hands are gnarled now, their steps slow, but when they look at each other, there's a flicker of understanding built over decades. Not love at first sight, not passion, but something sturdy, weathered, and real. As night falls over the city and torches are lit one by one along the streets, you tuck yourself into a small inn above a bakery. The scent of bread wafts through the walls. From the street below, laughter rises, young voices carefree, maybe not yet burdened by the weight of vows and dowries. You pull the blanket tighter and stare at the ceiling, thinking about how many girls and boys crossed that invisible line into marriage before they even knew what it meant. And how, despite the expectations, the pressure, and the peril, some still manage to find small joys. The night deepens, and with it the questions. What if a girl wanted to wait? What if a boy refused? What happened to those who didn't follow the path? We'll find those answers soon enough. For now, rest. Tomorrow we explore the exceptions, the outcasts, and the brave few who dared to rewrite their own fates. You wake to soft birdsong and the sound of a distant bell tolling somewhere beyond the rooftops. You're in the attic of the Bakery Inn, sunlight, warming the wooden beams above your head. The scent of rising dough is still thick in the air, but today you're not following the scent of bread. You're following the trail of outliers, the rare cases where someone didn't marry at the right age or didn't marry at all. Because for all the rigid customs and relentless expectations, there were always people who stepped outside the path and paid the price or reaped the freedom, depending on who was telling the story. You leave the inn and wander down a quiet lane toward the edge of the city, where a small group of elderly women sits spinning wool. Their hands move swiftly, but their voices are slow and thoughtful. One of them, Agnes, is said to be the oldest spinster in the district. She never married, not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. Her family tried, she tells you with a crooked smile. They lined up suitors when she was 14, 15, even 17. But she turned them all away. Didn't like the look of their eyes, she says. Didn't want their babies. Didn't want their names. So she stayed home, helped with the animals, took care of her younger siblings. When her parents died, she stayed on. She worked hard, lived frugally, and managed to keep the cottage. No husband, no children. Just time, peace, and the occasional rumor that she was a witch. Because that's what happened to many women who didn't marry. They became objects of suspicion. A woman alone was unnatural, dangerous, unsettling to the social fabric. She wasn't cared for, claimed, or controlled. And that to some made her a threat. As you pass through the market square, you hear snippets of stories about other such women herbalists, midwives, widows who never remarried. Some were respected, even revered for their knowledge. Others were cast out, muttered about behind hands, accused of everything from cursing livestock to luring husbands. Men, too, faced scrutiny if they avoided marriage. A man who didn't wed by his mid-20s might be questioned about his finances, his health, even his morality. Was he lazy? Was he strange? Was he hiding something? Marriage was considered a stabilizer, a civilizing force. To opt out of it was to stand apart, to risk being labeled less than fully adult. You sit on a stone wall overlooking a sheep pasture and think about how deeply marriage was woven into every layer of medieval life. It wasn't just a personal milestone, it was your passport into full society. It allowed you to own property, raise children, host neighbors, make decisions. Without it, your place in the world was ambiguous at best. And yet, there were always exceptions. You remember the stories you've heard along your journey of girls who escaped into convents, boys who fled arranged marriages to join mercenary bands or pilgrimage routes. Not all of them ended well, but not all of them ended badly either. You continue walking into the countryside where a small, ivy-covered chapel stands alone by a stream. A lone priest lives here tending to a handful of nearby villagers. He invites you in for a bowl of broth and tells you about a couple from years ago, childhood sweethearts, who waited until they were nearly 30 to marry. They were poor but stubborn. They refused to be forced apart or matched with others. Eventually, the families relented. When they finally wed, the entire village came to the ceremony. Not out of duty, but joy. It was rare, the priest says, but not impossible. Love finds a way, he smiles, even in the tightest corners. You leave the chapel and make your way up a grassy hill where a crumbling tower overlooks the valley below. Once, this tower belonged to a minor noble family. Now it's empty except for the birds and ivy. A faded mural on the inner wall depicts a wedding scene, gold leaf still clinging to the edges. A young bride with a pale face and distant eyes. A groom who looks stiff, armored more for war than marriage. And in the corner, nearly hidden, a woman watching from the shadows. Unsmiling, unnamed. You wonder who she was. A sister who wasn't chosen, a cousin who refused. A servant who loved in silence. Every wedding had its observers, its sacrifices, its silences. Every marriage left someone out. As twilight falls, you follow a stone path to a small glen, where wildflowers sway in the breeze. Here you sit and think of all the lives that didn't fit the mold. The girls who weren't married by 12 or 14, the boys who never became husbands, the elders who told the next generation to wait a little longer. You think about how marriage age wasn't just about numbers, it was about pressure, about fear, about control, but also about courage. The quiet kind that refuses, the stubborn kind that delays, the bold kind that dares to ask, what if I'm not ready? And so, as stars prick the sky and night wraps the world in velvet, you rise and keep walking. There are more truths to uncover, more questions to ask. Because while marriage may have been the rule, history always leaves room for the ones who whispered, "Not yet." You're walking now beneath a sky streaked with gray clouds rolling in slow and heavy, as if the heavens themselves are weighed down by centuries of forgotten vows. The road ahead bends toward the coast, where salt air mixes with smoke from peat fires and the distant clang of harbor bells. You're heading to a fishing village where the sea writes its own rules, and marriage, though still bound by tradition, takes on a slightly different rhythm. As you enter the village, children run barefoot between boats pulled up on shore, and women gut fish with fingers quick from years of repetition. You speak with a weathered sailor named Eowyn, who tells you his wife was 14 when they married. He was 20, already missing part of one finger from a pulley accident. He says he married her not because he wanted to, but because he was told to. His father had debts. Her family had nets. A union cleared the books, and a life began. She hated the smell of salt, he mutters. Still does. You notice something else here, though, something subtle. The women work beside the men. They haul ropes, patch sails, haggle with traders. Marriages in this community aren't romantic, but they are practical. Partnerships forged out of necessity. Age still skews young 12, 13, 14, but readiness is measured not in years, but in labor. If you can work, you can wed. Still, it doesn't mean it's easier. One woman, her apron stained with fish scales, tells you she lost her first child at 15. Another had 5 children by 20 and says she can't remember what it felt like to sit in the sun without someone pulling at her sleeve. Their voices are steady, but you sense the fatigue beneath. Marriage here didn't just begin early, it never truly let up. You move inland into hillier farmland where the houses stand farther apart and stories take longer to reach you. At one isolated homestead, you meet a man who was wed at 20 to a girl of just 12. I waited, he insists. Didn't touch her for 2 years. She was still playing with dolls. He says it as if it proves something. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. But it reflects an uncomfortable truth of the medieval world. Delaying consummation wasn't always practiced, but it was often idealized. Priests sometimes advised it. Doctors occasionally recommended it, but enforcement. That was left to the conscience of the groom. And not every groom had a conscience. You stop by a roadside shrine where villagers leave offerings, ribbons, buttons, broken combs for Saint Margaret of Antioch, protector of women in childbirth. Her statue stands, watch her expression sorrowful and serene. A young girl kneels at her feet, whispering prayers. She's not married yet, but you can guess what's coming. She wears a new ribbon in her hair and avoids your gaze. Her hands keep twisting the hem of her tunic, nervous, uncertain. She can't be more than 12. In this moment, the abstract becomes real. You've heard numbers read laws, watched ceremonies. But here is a girl on the cusp, not a noble or a peasant, not a number on a page, just a child praying to survive what comes next. You move on quietly, as if to give her privacy she's not likely to find elsewhere. In a larger village a few miles down the road, you're invited to a feast. A local couple is celebrating their daughter's 15th birthday and her engagement. The celebration is lively. Bread, meat, dancing. Her betrothed is 19 and seems gentle enough. They hold hands awkwardly and smile too much. It's clear they barely know each other, but there's something sweet in the way they glance and then look away. Maybe they'll be happy, maybe not. But compared to the stories you've heard, it feels like a breath of fresh air. You overhear her mother explaining to a guest that they waited on purpose. Too many girls get taken too soon, she says. We kept her close. Let her grow a bit. She's still young, of course, is still barely past childhood, but her mother's voice holds pride. In this village, 15 is practically late. But they waited, and that mattered. The feast continues late into the evening, and you step outside for air. The stars overhead are bright, the fields behind the village humming with the quiet of sleeping livestock and wind through barley. You realize that the story of marriage age in the medieval world isn't just about church doctrine or parental pressure. It's about how communities define time. Not in hours or even years, but in milestones. A girl's first bleed, a boy's first harvest, a family's first worry about shame. Marriage came at the moment when the world decided you were ready even if your heart and body were not. You sit beneath a tree and close your eyes, remembering the faces from the road, the child with a prayer, the woman with 5 children before 20, the noble girl holding a painted flower in her lap, the merchant's daughter who never laughed again after she was sent away. Each one a story. Each one a name we'll never read in a chronicle or carving. But they mattered. Because the truth is, the age of marriage was never just about age. It was about control. About making sure children became adults before they could ask why they had to. About keeping power where it already was, in the hands of fathers, kings, priests, and sometimes husbands. And still, in cracks between those stones, little seeds of rebellion grew. Some waited longer. Some said no. Some found kindness. Some even found love. You stretch, feel the cool earth beneath your hands, and let the night cradle you. Tomorrow you'll journey to the manors and monasteries where marriage ages were shaped by scholarship politics and property law. But tonight, let the wind carry you through the quiet fields and over rooftops. You're not alone. You walk with centuries of children called to adulthood before their time. Their footsteps are still here, and so are yours. The fields behind you fade into a golden haze as dawn spills over the hilltops. You rise slowly, stretching limbs that ache from the road, and begin your walk again, this time toward a stone bridge that leads to one of the largest abbey schools in the region. The closer you get, the more polished everything becomes. The roads are cobbled. The gates are iron. The people speak Latin here, not all the time, but enough to remind you that this place is different. It's a world where learning and law shape lives just as much as crops and weather. Here you enter a universe of parchment doctrine and debate. And in this world, the age of marriage is more than tradition, it's policy. You step into the cloisters where robed scholars argue quietly about canon law, inheritance statutes, and betrothal conditions. These men scribes, priests, notaries, are the architects of the very rules you've seen lived out on muddy fields and among crumbling cottages. They don't wield swords or plows, but pens, and their ink shapes the futures of children they will never meet. One gray-bearded man shows you a manuscript dated a century earlier. It contains the church's legal minimum girls may marry at 12, boys at 14. He explains the reasoning: puberty, procreation, the potential for a shared household. But even as he recites the logic, there's a weariness in his eyes. It is lawful, he says, but not always wise. He tells you of bishops who urged couples to delay consummation until both partners were more mature. He references councils that frowned upon rushed marriages, or those made under pressure. And yet, for every recommendation to wait, there were loopholes, inconsistencies, and gaps wide enough to lose a childhood in. Marriage consent could be spoken in private. Witnesses were not always required. A promise followed by intimacy could make a union valid in the eyes of the church, even if it defied every social expectation. You walk through the library past stacks of ledgers and birth records. A monk unrolls a scroll documenting a local dispute. A girl aged 13 was married without her father's blessing, only for the church to validate the marriage later when the girl refused to leave her husband. It caused a scandal, and 2 families nearly went to war. She wanted it, the monk shrugs, but she was still a child. This is where the paradox lies. Canon law claimed to protect children, yet it was often the very thing that enabled their early marriages. A girl could not make a binding contract about land or money, but she could say, "I do," and be forever bound by it. You sit beside a young novitiate in the garden, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She tells you that she chose the convent after watching her sister's wedding at 12 to a man she barely knew. She stopped smiling, the novitiate says. She used to sing all the time. Then she just stopped. In her eyes, you see that fear wasn't just about the physical danger of childbirth. It was about losing the self, vanishing into a role that left little room for anything else. You walk on following a winding path from the abbey into the nearby manorial estates. Here, the question of marriage age is buried beneath layers of parchment and politics. Landowners marry to gain property. Lords marry to secure borders. And age, it is merely a technicality managed by stewards and lawyers. You watch as a father, noble stern, negotiates a match for his 10-year-old daughter. Her fiancé, age 16, is an heir to a struggling estate, and their union will merge 2 ancient lines. The girl is present, but ignored. She's told to stand still and smile. At a neighboring estate, you speak with a woman in her 20s, widowed, childless, and recently remarried to a cousin in order to keep land within the family. She laughs bitterly when you ask her how she felt about it. "My feelings weren't invited," she says. "They never are, but I keep the ledger balanced and the servants paid, and that's what matters." She'd been first married at 13. The wedding feast had more toasts than she had years, and yet despite the suffocating formality, some cracks appear. You overhear a steward advising a lord to wait until a girl is at least 15 to avoid scandal. You hear a scribe muttering that Rome is slow to respond to appeals over betrothal disputes. You see a boy, barely 14, staring blankly at the marriage contract being explained to him, clearly overwhelmed, clearly unready. But the document is signed anyway. The manorial world presents a contradiction, an obsession with legacy, yet an indifference to the people bound up in its plans. Age is a tool, not a concern. If a girl can tie a veil, she can be wed. If a boy can hold a pen, he can inherit a wife. That evening, you join a meal at the long table of a minor noble house. Candles flicker, meat steams, and conversation turns, as it always does to alliances. A younger son jokes that he'll have to marry a wealthy merchant's daughter soon. He's 17, his father reminds him, already overdue. Across the table, a girl of 14 sips watered wine, eyes downcast, a ring already on her hand. Her wedding is in spring. After dinner, you step outside into the courtyard and stare up at the stars. You try to imagine the feeling of standing on the edge of your life at 13, 14, watching it be carved into shapes you had no hand in designing. And yet across Europe, across centuries, this was the norm, not the exception. You breathe in the cool night air and realize how deeply these patterns were set. They weren't just cultural, they were institutional. Backed by law, enforced by landowners, blessed by priests. It wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a system, one that valued continuity above childhood. power over preparation. And yet, as always, within this system, you find resistance. Girls who dragged their feet, boys who ran, mothers who stalled, priests who looked the other way just long enough for the match to fall through. There's still more to explore. The next leg of the journey will take you into the villages where superstition, folklore, and fertility rites sometimes rewrote the rules entirely. But for now, rest beneath the stone arches and ivy-choked towers. Let your mind drift not into romance but reality. The quiet, often unseen lives behind the contracts and customs. Because the age they married was only part of the story. What happened after the vows, that's what truly shaped them. Morning breaks gently over the ivy-clad towers as you rise from your resting place near the manor's courtyard. The stone beneath you is cold, but the light is warm, soft gold, slipping through high windows and dappling the floor like spilled honey. You stretch, roll your shoulders, and step back onto the winding road. The path now leads eastward into smaller villages, places where rules bend a little more, where tradition is embroidered with folklore and old ways that predate the church itself. You cross a stream on a narrow plank bridge and find yourself in a hamlet, nestled at the edge of a forest. There are no walls, no guards, no noble houses, just reed-roofed cottages, crooked fences, and barefoot children scattering chickens. It feels timeless. And here, marriage is still shaped by age, but also by rituals far older than parchment and Latin. You're greeted by a toothless old woman sitting on a stool outside her home, her fingers threading beads into what looks like a wedding charm. She grins, offers you a seat, and begins to talk. In her youth, she says girls were married just after their first blood. No birthday candles, no contracts, just the rhythm of the body and the turning of the seasons. You bled, you wed. She shrugs as if that was the most natural sentence in the world. Didn't matter if you were ready. Nature said you were. In these communities, the church's official ages still loomed in the background, 12 and 14, but local customs often held equal weight. A girl might be deemed ripe for marriage not by her years, but by omens, dreams, or the way she danced during midsummer festivals. One woman tells you of a match made after a girl successfully balanced a clay jug on her head during a harvest dance. It meant she had the hips, she says with a wink. It sounds whimsical, charming even, but the underlying truth is sobering. Beneath the colorful ceremonies and celebratory feasts lies the same old structure. Young girls paired off early young boys, expected to prove themselves with livestock or plowed fields, and families trying to secure their legacy before illness or hunger knocked again. You stay to witness one such ceremony. It's not a full wedding, but a betrothal, what the villagers call a binding. A girl of about 12 stands beneath a wooden arch woven with hawthorn branches. Her betrothed is 15, proud and stiff, in his cleanest tunic. The village-wise woman sprinkles salt in a circle around them, while a small crowd watches silently. The two hold hands as their names are spoken aloud. No parchment, no ink, just words and will. In the eyes of this community, they're promised. The rest will follow soon. Later by the fire, an old man named Tomas shares his memories. He was married at 16 to a girl of 13. She didn't speak to me for a month, he says with a slow smile. But she made the best broth in the village. He speaks of her gently. She died young after their third child. He never remarried. Not because he wasn't allowed, he simply didn't want to. She was the best mistake I ever made, he says. In these stories, you begin to see a strange pattern, one of endurance. The marriages might have been arranged, rushed, even coerced. But people still lived them. They found moments of connection, small rebellions, laughter. In a world where you didn't get to choose when you married, you learned to choose what you did with what came after. And not all unions were sanctioned, even here. You meet a girl of 15 who lives on the edge of the village with her grandmother. She ran away from an engagement arranged when she was 11. Her family disowned her. The villagers gossip. Some say she's cursed. Others bring her bread in secret. She works as a weaver now, barely scraping by, but her eyes are clear. At least I chose my hunger, she says. You ask the wise woman if many girls tried to escape arranged marriages. Some, she replies, but most stay. Not because they want to, because they don't know there's another way. The path winds farther into the woods, where you stumble upon a clearing used for fertility rites. The villagers don't speak of it openly, but you hear whispers. During spring festivals, couples would sometimes declare themselves wed under the stars, away from priest and parent. These unions weren't always recognized by the church, but they were remembered by the forest. These were love matches, sometimes made in secret, sometimes reversed, when the season turned. But for a few, they stuck. You find a pair of elders who married this way 50 years ago. No ring, no priest, the man says. Just her hand and a fire between us. Such stories offer something rare, a glimpse of autonomy of age, not dictated by rule books, but by mutual choice. They're rare, yes, but they exist. And as you settle beneath the canopy of ancient oaks, the sun filtering through like light through stained glass, you begin to wonder what it must have felt like to be one of those who waited, who held out, who chose. They were few, but they were real. Because for all the customs, the rules, the written laws, and whispered warnings, age in the medieval world was never just about numbers. It was about power, about pressure, about position, and about what happened when people, especially the young, decided in whatever small way to push back. As night falls and the fireflies blink into being, you close your eyes and listen to the rustle of the trees. They've seen it all, the early brides, the reluctant grooms, the vanished girls, the bold lovers. The forest remembers, and so do you. There's more still to learn about widows' remarriage, second chances, and those who dared to love twice. So rest now and follow me when you're ready. The road continues. You rise at first light, brushing dew from your cloak, as the forest releases its breath in long, cool sighs. Today, the road carries you not toward new marriages, but into the afterlives of old ones. The second chapters, the ones shaped not by youth and ceremony, but by what came after, by death, by abandonment, by the unexpected weight of freedom. You're walking into a world of widows and remarriage, and once again, age will not behave the way you expect it to. As you leave the woodland paths behind and approach the edge of a fortified town, you notice something different in the air. The smell of iron oil ink. This is a town of records, and records don't forget. You pass a stone hall where scribes in woolen robes scratch names into ledgers by candlelight. Marriage records, death notices, dowry claims. One of them allows you to look over his shoulder as he completes an entry, a widow age 14, remarrying a 32-year-old tanner. You pause. 14. A widow. You ask if there's been a mistake, but the scribe just shakes his head. Not uncommon, he says. Childbirth takes quickly. So does fever. Marriage doesn't wait. And it's true. In a world where girls wed at 12 or 13, widowhood could arrive before the second year. And once it did, the cycle often began again because a young widow was still a viable bride. Her womb was proven her value intact. A second marriage was not a tragedy. It was a transaction renewed. In many places, the remarriage of a young widow was arranged with as much urgency as her first, sometimes more. A widow with no children might return to her father's house, but a widow with even one surviving child often needed the support of a new husband, someone to feed, protect, and represent the household. Choice again was rarely hers. You meet one such woman, a pale, soft-spoken girl no older than 15, living with her second husband on the outskirts of the market town. Her first marriage lasted only a year. He died of blood cough, she says. She shrugs when you ask if she grieved. I barely knew him. Her second husband is kind, she says. Quiet, old enough to be her father, but respectful. He gives me time, she adds. Time to grow into this. It's one of the rare moments of gentleness you've heard along your journey. And still the undercurrent remains. No one asked if she wanted to remarry. It was simply assumed. Even the church encouraged it. Widows were often reminded of their duty to remarry, especially young ones. Virginity was sacred, yes, but widowhood was not. The longer a widow remained single, the more she risked poverty scandal or both. You pass a chapel where a priest delivers a sermon on the virtues of the second chance. He speaks of Ruth, of loyalty, of honor, but later you hear whispers that he was recently paid by a wealthy widower to publicly endorse the man's marriage to a 14-year-old girl. She's a widow, they say. It's respectable. Even so, you can feel the discomfort in the room, like fog clinging to old stone. Not all second marriages were so convenient. You meet a woman named Isabel in her late 20s, considered well past marrying age when her first husband died. She never remarried. Not by choice, but because no one offered. Too sharp-tongued, she admits with a smirk. She earns her keep now by dyeing fabric and brewing mead. Her hands are stained, her eyes sharper than any you've seen. I'm alone, she says, but I sleep in my own bed, wake on my own terms. That counts for something. She offers you a cup of her bitter brew and tells you about her cousin, a widow at 12, remarried by 14, dead by 15. She wanted to join a convent, Isabel mutters. They said no, said it was wasteful. Wasteful because she could still produce heirs. Wasteful because her father had already invested in a dowry. You feel that word echo in your chest. Wasteful. As though a girl's life was only worthwhile if paired with someone else's. As though her timeline didn't belong to her at all. And yet you continue to meet exceptions. An innkeeper in a port town tells you of a runaway widow who disguised herself as a man and took to the sea. Another village elder tells you about his mother, widowed at 13, refused to remarry, and ran the family farm until the age of 70. There were always cracks in the system, always places where stories slipped through. At one abbey, you come across a list of disobedient widows, women who refused second marriages arranged by their families. Some were punished. Some were exiled, but some were quietly allowed to remain unmarried, especially if they took up religious service or agreed to surrender their dowries to the church. In a few rare cases, women bought their freedom outright, using the inheritance left by their late husbands. But that required education, access, a level of confidence that few were allowed to grow into. In a quieter moment, you find yourself sitting with an old gravedigger outside a churchyard. He's placing stones on a patch of unmarked graves. Child brides, he says. Married, buried. Most never made it to 20. You ask if he ever knew any who lived long enough to love again. He nods. One, he says. She married 3 times. First for her father. Second for her children. third for herself. He smiles faintly. That last one. That was the only time I saw her dance. And with that image, the light begins to fade. You sit quietly beneath the trees, letting the stories settle around you like autumn leaves. The road to marriage in medieval times did not end with a wedding. It looped, curved, repeated, sometimes cruelly, sometimes unexpectedly tender. And all along, age played a different role. You could be 13 and a widow, 14 and a mother, 15 and on your third vow. As the sky darkens and the wind picks up, you pull your cloak tighter and close your eyes. Tomorrow, you'll explore how marriage age evolved across generations, how customs shifted, how families remembered, how girls whispered to each other what they weren't allowed to say aloud. But tonight, let these stories rest with you. Let the widows have their peace. Let the fire burn low. And let the years stretch softly forward like footsteps leaving behind everything that came too soon. The wind is soft as it carries you into the next village, less a town than a memory, tucked between fields of rye and barley. You arrive as dawn breaks over smoke-threaded rooftops, and the first human voices rise with the crows. This place feels older than the others, not in years, but in rhythm. Time here is measured not by the toll of bells or the turning of court documents, but by stories passed down beside hearth fires, where generations echo through each other like verses in a song. Today you've come to trace those echoes, to learn how marriage customs shifted from one age to the next, and how the age of marriage, once fixed like stone, began to soften around the edges. You settle beside a fire with a woman named Hedda. Her hands are gnarled, her braids white, her voice smooth as river stones. She begins with her grandmother, who married at 12. She never saw her husband's face before the wedding, Hedda says. She was handed a kerchief and a comb and told, "This is your life now." Her grandmother gave birth at 13 and died by 21, worn to pieces. Then came Hedda's mother, married at 15. Not much better, she mutters, but she had a few more choices. She got to say no once. That was progress. And then Hedda herself, married at 17, old by village standards. She smiles at the word old and rocks forward slightly. But I chose him. He made me laugh. He had crooked teeth and kind eyes. This story unfolds slowly, like cloth unraveling. And as Hedda speaks, you begin to see what changed over time. Not the expectations, not entirely, but the subtle shifting of possibilities. By the later Middle Ages, especially in Northern Europe, the average age of marriage, particularly among the lower classes, began to rise. For women, it moved from 13 or 14 to 16, 17, even into the early 20s. For men, from 15 or 16 to their mid-20s. You hear about this again and again as you visit more homes. A baker says his daughter will marry when she's ready to keep a household, not before. She's 17, unmarried, and everyone seems perfectly fine with that. In another village, a carpenter's son speaks proudly of waiting until he could build his own cottage. "Not taking a wife until I had a roof of my own," he says, pounding his chest like it was a knightly oath. Why the shift? Part of it, you discover, has to do with economics. As towns grew and economies expanded, marriage became tied to independence, not just age. A couple needed resources to form a new household, land, tools, a trade. This required time, and time slowly began to be allowed. In parts of England, the Low Countries and Scandinavia, this trend grew into something historians would later call the European marriage pattern. People waited. They married later. Fewer children, more stability. For a time, this reshaped entire societies. Birth rates slowed. Inheritance patterns changed. Girls gained a sliver more space to breathe before being placed into the roles their mothers never questioned. But it wasn't universal. In Italy, Spain, southern France, especially among the nobility, early marriages remained the norm. Marriage was less about readiness and more about control of bloodlines, wealth, and alliances. In one noble family, you visit a girl is promised at 10, wed at 12, and has her first child at 13. She survived, her aunt says almost proudly. So many didn't. And that word survive carries the weight of 100 girls who didn't. Still, you meet women in these lands, even within the gentry, who remember being given more say than their mothers. One noblewoman recalls her marriage at 16 as a negotiation. Her father asked her opinion. Her mother counseled her privately. They couldn't change the system, she says, but they helped me find a better place inside it. Change, you realize, came not just from rebellion, but from tiny acts of subversion, mothers whispering to daughters, fathers, delaying betrothals, priests turning a blind eye when a girl said no. And sometimes change came from tragedy. A village that lost half its girls to childbirth one winter began delaying marriages the next spring. A lord whose wife died in labor at 14 refused to marry his daughters before 16. A convent overrun with child widows refused to accept anyone under 15, claiming even the Virgin Mary deserved time. These shifts weren't always written down. They weren't celebrated with banners or sermons, but they left their mark in slightly older brides, slightly fewer funerals, slightly longer gaps between childhood and motherhood. You find an old graveyard just outside a chapel. The stones are mossy, the names worn. You kneel before one Annis wife, Mother Weaver, married at 17, died at 60. A long life by medieval standards. A full one. And then you see another Marjorie wife and mother married at 11, died at 12. A single year. A breath. You leave a flower for both. Later, in a village square, you meet a group of young girls dancing in a circle, their bare feet scuffing up dust. One of them asks if you know how to spin. You shake your head. She grins. "I'm not marrying till I learn," she says boldly, and her friends laugh with her, not at her. You sit down to watch them, realizing that maybe this is what progress looked like in the medieval world. Not revolution, but ripples. Girls who waited a little longer. Parents who questioned. Communities that began to ask not just when someone should marry, but whether they were ready. And as the sun lowers behind the hills and the air turns thick with summer warmth, you think of all the lives you've passed through, all the stories, all the moments when someone usually quietly, usually alone, chose to pause. In a world that demanded they grow up too soon, they hesitated, just long enough to change the story for the one who came next. The road bends again ahead. You're nearly to the end. Just one more stretch to walk. One more truth to uncover. Then finally, you'll rest. You wake beneath the branches of an old chestnut tree, the morning breeze rattling its leaves like soft applause. The village behind you is quiet now, its windows shuttered against the sun, and you sense that your journey is nearing its close. But before you turn toward rest, you head for one last place, the kind of place few mention when speaking of marriage, but where its consequences echo loudest the household. Because if marriage began with a ceremony, and often too young an age, its full weight landed in the everyday, the silent rhythm of work, weariness, and waiting. You walk through the gates of a modest farmhouse where a young woman, barely 16, leans over a wash basin. Her hair is tied up in a kerchief, her hands raw from scrubbing. She was married at 14, Now she wakes before the sun to tend the goats, knead dough, fetch water, mend linens, sweep ash, and care for her infant. Her husband is kind, she says, not cruel, but he is often gone and she is often alone. I thought I would feel older, she admits quietly, but I just feel tired. Around her are the quiet signs of a life not yet grown into dolls tucked under a bench. A faded flower crown hanging by the door, a journal with only one page written. No one asked her what she wanted before she was married. And now that she's married, the asking has stopped altogether. You follow her through the day, feeding chickens, boiling porridge, singing softly to her baby, while plucking weeds from the garden. She is competent, but not content. There is no room for dreams here. Her story is not a tragedy, but it is a theft, not of her life, but of her youth. You move from home to home and the pattern repeats. Girls with swollen ankles and quiet eyes. Boys who look like men, but speak with the softness of those not ready to command. In many places, they are still just children playing at adulthood, guided not by desire, but by duty. And yet within these walls, you also see resilience. A woman who was married at 12 now teaches her daughters to read before they're matched. A boy of 17 insists he won't marry until his sister does. She's older. She gets to choose first. These are quiet revolutions, but revolutions nonetheless. You sit with a midwife in her cottage at the edge of the village. She has seen hundreds of births and too many deaths. Her eyes are sharp, her voice low. She tells you the worst are the youngest mothers, the ones whose hips are too narrow, whose hearts beat too fast. I try to tell the fathers to wait, she says. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. She shows you a ledger she's kept her own, not the church's. A book of names, ages, outcomes. Girls married at 12, dead at 13. Girls married at 15, mothers by 16, buried by 20. And yet also women who lasted, who bore the storm, who raised daughters that waited a little longer. As twilight begins to fall, you visit one last home. A woman in her 50s tends a garden of rosemary and sage. She was married at 17. It was late for the time, she says, but it gave me space. And that space became everything. She gestures to her garden, her grown son sitting on the steps with a lute, her grandchild sleeping beside the hearth. I chose, and I taught my children to choose. Her words settle in your chest like warm bread. Because here at the end, you see the truth not just of when people married, but of what they did with what came after. The age may have been too young, the customs too cruel, but within that framework some carved out peace. Some found meaning, some lit candles in the dark. And now, as night falls for the last time on this journey, you step out into an open field. The stars appear one by one. The wind carries the voices of generations, girls whispering in the dark, mothers humming lullabies, young wives telling stories they weren't supposed to know. You stand among them listening, because that's all any of them ever wanted, to be heard. And you have heard them. So now, with your mind full of their footsteps and your heart full of their echoes, you lie down beneath the stars and close your eyes. Let the centuries pass. Let the stories rest. Let them be remembered just as they were. You're lying in a field of soft grass now, the stars like pinpricks in deep velvet above you. The breeze carries the faintest hints of wood smoke, crushed time, and something sweeter, maybe memory, maybe quiet. Everything is still. Everything is enough. The road is behind you. The girls, the boys, the brides too young to know what love meant. The men who waited. The women who didn't. The elders who watched, who remembered, who whispered warnings that sometimes went unheard. Their lives have circled you, layered over one another, like rings on old oak. And now the weight of their stories is not heavy, it's grounding, like soil, like sleep. You take a breath and feel how far you've traveled, not in miles, but in years. In the beating hearts of those who came before, in the questions they weren't allowed to ask, in the strength they still found. Some suffered, some loved, some endured long enough to pass on better stories. And you listened. You carried them with you. And now they carry you. So breathe. Let your muscles loosen. Let your thoughts drift. There's nothing left to figure out. No more chapters to read. Just the rhythm of your breath, slow and even like waves against a quiet shore. You're safe here. You're home here. And the story has ended exactly where it needed to.